Aniin everyone, I'm finally back today. There was a little break with filming just because I was waiting for my new iPhone to come in. So I finally have something that has a little better quality. It's not exactly a super fancy video camera or anything, but I got an iPhone 11. I was using the 8 prior, so I'm expecting the quality to be quite a bit better, which I'm thankful for. So I am filming outside today, and I feel anytime I choose to film outside, it's quiet when I come out here, and then immediately people start mowing their lawns with like tractors or something, and it's super loud. But nonetheless, I don't own outside, even though this is native land. My neighborhood doesn't revolve around my YouTube schedule or me, so whatever. Hopefully that like constant humming is done soon. I don't know. I want to move inside, but it's such a nice day. You know what? I'm staying here. Okay, so today I'm doing a continued Indigenous favorites video, and I chose 5 books again just to kind of keep it cohesive. These are all fiction, and I think in the future I'm going to do a non-fiction as well. Maybe Indigenous memoirs. I have a lot of Indigenous poetry I like to read, so I can have an abundance of favorite videos in the future. Okay, so let's just get right on into it now that we have some peace and quiet. The first one is a book I've reread many times. This is probably one of my most reread novels. It's a work of fiction, and it's called The Break by Metis author Katharina Vermette. Now, this book is set in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is where I was born and raised. I would say this is a testament to the resilience of Indigenous women and the violence they face. And I would also say that this is like a love song to Winnipeg as well, and how central to the lives of Indigenous people, like their communities are, and the cities that they're from are. You know, a lot of Indigenous people didn't grow up on reserves. They grew up in urban areas, and that can often lead to a lot of disconnection from their culture. But a lot of the times in the city, Indigenous people will come together, and they and their families will carve out their own community in the city. I will say that there are trigger warnings in this novel for rape, violence, racism. It's a really, really powerful work of fiction. I have not really met anyone who's read this book who hasn't liked it. This was published, I believe, in, I want to say 2016. Yes, it was published in 2016. And if you liked The Break, I would really recommend, if you liked There, I would really recommend checking out The Break. You know, both deal with urban Indigenous life. They both have multiple narrators, multiple characters who narrate, and they both kind of center upon an event that's the catalyst for a lot of emotions and a lot of change. And it's phenomenally written. I think that the plot is written in a way that really hooks you in, and you need to keep reading to find out what's going to happen. I think having a novel like this, again, that is sort of a testament to Indigenous strength of Indigenous women, it's phenomenal. If you're from Winnipeg, you're gonna like, I haven't read a book in a long time that's described Winnipeg as well. And actually, for all the Winnipeggers who might be watching this, maybe you might know of the Windmill Cafe that's unfortunately closed down now, but it was part of Winnipeg's North End for decades, and I actually used to work at the Windmill Cafe, and I knew the owners really well, and the Windmill Cafe is mentioned in here, so it was just really nice and kind of nostalgic. Okay, so next up is Moccasin Square Gardens by Dene author Richard Van Camp. I read this, was it last summer, I believe, and I was just blown away. This is a book of short stories, and they made me laugh, They made me cry. Some of them were very scary. But what I liked about this is I feel like Richard Van Camp has a way of writing that makes you feel like you're just hanging out with your cousin. Like you're listening to your cousin, telling funny stories on the reservation. It's just relaxed. The writing is extremely good and extremely beautiful. And so it just has this mood about it that I don't really get from a lot of other authors, where it just feels very conversational, but you also feel like you're getting a glimpse into something very important. And you know, when you're reading a book and you just like within the first couple pages, you're like, this is good. Like I am going to love this. And then you read it all the way through and you did love it. And you're like surprised because sometimes that doesn't always work out, but you're also like, no, I knew it. This book was gold. And this book was gold. It's just amazing. Richard Van Camp is a genius, and if you haven't read this yet, I highly recommend it. And you know, it's not a huge commitment. It's like just a little over 150 pages, so it's a quick read, it's an entertaining read, and it's very funny. Okay, so next up is Birdie by Cree and Métis author Tracy Lindbergh. This book is one of my favorites. It's another one that I've read. I believe I've read it 3 times now. What can I say about this novel? It's one that I had a hard time reviewing because I had so much like emotions invested into this book and in defending this book, and wanting to like portray it correctly in my review. Unfortunately, this is a novel that has a lot of Goodreads reviews and there's one particular YouTube review I watched years ago that just was like, in my personal opinion, atrocious. And I feel like these reviews are written by non-Indigenous people who don't understand what Tracy Lindbergh was doing with this novel, or what this novel was trying to do. I've said this a lot, especially in my other book reviews, but I think it's really important to go into Indigenous literature with no preconceptions, no colonial mindsets. Like you really need to just have a lens that you're reading a specific piece of tribal literature, in this case Cree, and you really need to just expand your mind, because this is a beautiful, fluid, non-Western piece of writing, and it's beautiful. And you follow the main character's name is Bernice, but her whole family calls her Birdie, and she's gone through a lot of intense physical and sexual trauma, so that's a trigger warning for this novel as well. And to deal with that, Bernice essentially goes to sleep for a very long time, but in her dreams she travels. And again, you see this is another book that speaks to the resilience of Indigenous women and familial connections. And you know, Birdie is really grounded by the love of the women in her life. You know, this book takes you on a ride that is so different. The prose is absolutely beautiful. And if you go into this book just with an open mind and go into it as like an experience, it's mind-blowing. And I think that's like, for myself, the beautiful thing about literature. And like sometimes what I don't understand when people say, this didn't make sense, this was weird, but they're approaching it from like a Western mindset. And if you just give this book a chance and really just like decolonize your thinking, you're gonna have a really great reading experience. And I'll just say quickly, the YouTube review in question had said, you know, I find it very unbelievable that Bernice had been pretty much assaulted by every man in her family, or every man that she met, something of that accord. And it's like, you're completely pretty much shouldering aside the experience of Indigenous women who that does happen to, because of intergenerational trauma, because of lateral violence. And yes, she's taken advantage of. And that's not like something fictionalized. That happens to Indigenous women everywhere. And so for me, that review was just really disappointing and really harmful. Next up is Crow Winter by Algonquin Anishinaabe author Karen McBride. It immediately became one of my favorite books. Immediately after I finished it, I wrote a review, told everybody I could, like, you need to read this book. It's so good. You know, it's a very honest depiction of what Anishinaabe people had to go through in terms of like land claims, settler colonialism, encroaching on Indigenous communities. And it's also a book about Indigenous grief. You know, the main character loses her father and is struggling with that grief, and that's when she meets a trickster in the shape of a crow, Nanabush. And if you know Ojibwe traditional storytelling, you'll know Nanabush, and you'll know the stories of him. So I thought this was honestly just a really great work of fiction that blended traditional Ojibwe stories with a new narrative. You know, you venture into the spirit world, you venture into ceremony. There's Anishinaabe Mowins scattered throughout the text. This book made me laugh. I cried. And I think that if you've lost one of your parents, this book, it really touched on certain things for me. And it brought me, honestly, quite a bit of healing. And I think sometimes I feel so lucky that there are books written by Anishinaabe authors that write about things like this, because as an Anishinaabe woman, it just feels like a friend is comforting you, and it feels like a text that you can really just like trust and read, and you know that tribal customs and tribal traditions are going to be handled properly. It's just a great work of fiction. Next up and lastly is Song of Batosh by Metis author Maya Karen. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Usually I look that up, but I forgot to this time. I love this novel. It's historical fiction, and it takes place in 1884 when Louis Riel arrives at Batosh to help the Metis fight for their land rights. So this was like incredibly well researched, incredibly steeped in history. I myself love learning about the Métis Rebellion and just everything around that time. Although sometimes it's hard to read because this was during a time when Canada was first trying to establish itself as a new country. They were building the Canadian Railroad. So towns were being built pretty much on the premise of being railroad towns, and those towns were predicted to be the most successful. And so John A. Macdonald and just colonizers in general were very, very adamant to steal land. You know, they swindled Métis out of their land, even though that they were promised certain rights. And so Louis Riel is what we call the founding father of Manitoba, and he wasn't having it. And he had actually fled to the US because when he was fighting for Métis land rights in Manitoba, essentially he was to be killed because of something that happened. I won't go into it. There's a lot of history with that. I could probably talk about that for hours. But if you look into Louis Riel and you read about his life, he was eventually executed by the Canadian government. And this novel was just, oh my god, I can't even sorry, I get really nerdy talking about it because it was just so well researched. And you know, after having read so many nonfiction books about this issue and about this time period, reading a work of fiction that was so well done, that revolved around Gabriel Dumas and Louis Riel, it was just such a treat, honestly. And if you like historical fiction, if you want to learn more about the struggle of the Métis and the rebellions that were led by Gabriel Dumas and Louis Riel, I highly recommend this. And you know, reading some nonfiction on the issue, reading some, articles on the internet never hurts. And I think if you do that before reading this, you're going to be absolutely blown away. So yeah, those are my additional top 5 favorites. I really do hope that some of you add these to your TBRs and end up reading them, because they are absolutely fantastic works of fiction, and I wouldn't hesitate recommending any of those to anybody. So anyway, that's it for me today, and miigwech.